I took it off. Please, she cried. The rancher froze and made his move. The morning lay heavy across the prairie, the kind of cold that muted even the sound of the wind. Dust clung to the dry grass like frost, and the horizon stretched flat and empty beneath a pale sky. A single cabin stood near a narrow ridge, its boards grey, its roof patched in places with tin that shone dull in the light. Smoke should have curled from the chimney, but there was none. The place looked deserted, as if time had forgotten it, and yet there were signs of life in the trampled earth near the fence and the faint tracks that led away from the well. The rancher rode slow, reins slack, the horse's breath puffing in white bursts. His hat was pulled low, shadowing eyes that had seen too many winters, too many graves. His coat hung heavy with dust and age, the leather cracked from years of sun. He had not meant to stop here, but something in the silence held him, a weight pressing down as if the land itself carried sorrow. He scanned the yard, the broken trough, the shutter flapping loose in the wind. Nothing moved, and yet he felt watched. Then he heard it. Not a cry, not a word, but the faintest sound, a stifled breath or a shiver against the cold. His hand went to the worn handle of his revolver out of habit, but he did not draw. He dismounted, boots crunching on the hard ground, and stepped toward the cabin. Each board creaked beneath his weight as he pushed the door, and it gave way with a tired groan. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint scent of smoke and something else, fear. In the corner, half hidden beneath a torn quilt, sat a girl. Her hair hung in tangled strands across her face, her dress ripped at the hem, her bare shoulders trembling. She clutched fabric in her hands as if trying to cover herself, but the weight of her shame was heavier than the cold. Her eyes lifted for only a second, dark and wide, before she looked away, pressing her forehead to her knees. She had no words, only silence that spoke louder than any scream. The rancher froze where he stood, the sight of her cutting deeper than any wound. In her small frame, abandoned and afraid, he saw not just a stranger, but a memory he thought he had buried. The echo of loss, the face of someone once left behind. The cabin was quiet except for the sound of her broken breathing, and he knew the world outside this room had just shifted. The rancher stood in the doorway, longer than he should have, torn between the instinct to turn back into the wind and the pull that kept his boots rooted to the floor. The girl had not moved, except for the slow rise of her shoulders as she breathed. She held herself tight, as if the air might tear her apart if she loosened her grip. Her silence pressed against him harder than words. It was the silence he knew from battlefields, from nights when he had laid awake listening to men dying softly so as not to wake others. It was the silence of people who no longer believed anyone was coming. He shifted his weight, and the board groaned beneath him. Her head lifted slightly, just enough for her eyes to flick toward him. They were not pleading eyes, they were not even angry. They were empty, wide pools that seemed to ask nothing because she expected nothing. He felt the sharp cut of shame, though he had done nothing yet. He remembered another winter, another cabin, a girl whose voice had broken when she begged him not to leave. That girl had been his sister, younger by 6 years, left in the care of neighbors when he marched off to war. By the time he came back, her grave was already sinking into the earth. The girl before him shifted, pulling the quilt higher to her chin. She wanted to disappear. He knew what that felt like. He wanted to vanish too, to close the door and ride on, to pretend he had never stopped, never heard, never seen. It would be easier. The world was cruel enough without taking on another burden. And yet, as he watched her, he knew leaving would not let him go free. Her face would follow him across the plains, would haunt him in every dawn and every silence until his own body returned to the dirt. His throat tightened as he tried to think of words, but there were none. He took a step closer, slow enough not to startle her, and she shrank back against the wall. His hands hovered useless at his sides, hard from work, but clumsy when it came to comfort. He wanted to tell her she was safe, but he could not promise that yet. He wanted to tell her he understood, but he feared the wound in her chest was deeper than words could reach. So he stood still, letting the moment stretch, hoping his presence might say what his tongue could not. The debate clawed at him. He could leave now, tell himself she would find her way, or that someone else would come. He could walk out and carry only the guilt, nothing more. But the thought of her shivering alone, eyes fixed on the door that would never open again, burned hotter than any fire. He had failed once before. He would not fail twice. At last he reached down, lifted the edge of the quilt she clung to, and set his weathered coat across her shoulders. She flinched, but did not push it away. His voice came low, roughened by years of dust and sorrow. "You're coming with me." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a vow he knew he could not break. The rancher eased the door shut behind him and let the silence sit heavy again. He could hear her breathing beneath the weight of his coat, but she did not speak. He crouched near the hearth and saw ashes cold and grey, as if no fire had burned for days. Hunger clung to the air the way fear did, sharp and sour. He set down his canteen, sliding it across the floor without a word. She hesitated before pulling it close, sipping as though each drop might be her last. The way she held the tin made him notice the brew, issues on her wrists, dark bands like ropes had bitten there. His jaw tightened. Someone had left her like this, someone cruel enough to bind her, cruel enough to walk away. When her eyes finally lifted again, there was no trust in them, only caution. But in that moment, he understood more than she could say. She had been abandoned, not by chance, but by design. He thought of men he had known, drunk fathers, bitter uncles, gangs who made money from pain. He did not need her words to see their shadows. She was running from something, or worse, she had been thrown to it. He rose and stepped outside for air, the weight pressing harder now. Tracks cut across the dirt near the cabin, boot prints, more than one pair, deep enough to mark men carrying weight. They had come recently, no older than a day. His stomach sank. Whoever left her here had not gone far. His horse shifted restlessly, ears twitching at a sound only it caught, and the rancher felt the same unease crawl up his spine. The land was too quiet, too watchful. A memory pressed at him, unwelcome but sharp. A night years back when his unit had been ambushed because they lingered too long at a farmhouse. The enemy had circled them, knowing they would stay for the wounded. He saw again the faces of the men who never rose with the dawn. That was the trap. Leave a soul broken in plain sight, then wait for the kind-hearted fool who stopped to help. He looked back at the cabin, at her fragile figure curled against the wall. Maybe she was bait, maybe she was a warning. But when she caught his eyes through the crack of the door, he knew she was also a child, terrified and used up by men who thought nothing of life. If he walked away, they would come for her again. If he stayed, they would come for them both. Either way, time was closing in. The horse stamped hard, ears pricked toward the ridge. The rancher's hand went to his reins. Volver this time, not just out of habit, but certainty. Somewhere out there, the men were circling back, ready to claim what they thought belonged to them. The rancher had taken the girl's silence. "Out here's ours. Don't make yourself part of it." The door rattled under another blow. He braced it with his shoulder, rifle at the ready. Through the window's cracked glass, he counted 3 men, all armed. One carried a length of chain, the other a shotgun slung loose over his shoulder. The third man, broad, scar across his jaw, looked too familiar. The rancher's breath caught. He knew that face. Years ago, in a saloon brawl, that same man had left a scar across his ribs with a broken bottle. Fate had circled them back. The standoff dragged, tension sharp enough to cut the air. The girl whimpered softly, and the sound drew the men like wolves. "Open up, cowboy," the scarred man sneered, "or we'll burn that shack and drag you both out." The rancher steadied his hands, his finger near the trigger, but not yet. He thought of her silence, her scars, her eyes empty of hope. If he gave her back, they would leave him alive. But she would be destroyed. If he resisted, blood would fall. Maybe his, maybe theirs. The choice weighed heavy, but his mind was already made. He kicked the table onto its side, pulling her behind it as the door crashed inward. The first man charged, chain swinging, but the rancher's rifle roared, and the man dropped hard, the chain clattering across the floorboards. The shotgun fired back, wood splintering, smoke filling the room. The girl covered her ears, shaking, but he stayed between her and the doorway, every muscle bent toward one purpose: keep her safe. Then came the twist. The scarred man did not aim at him. He aimed at her. "She ain't worth your grave," he spat, leveling the gun. In that instant, the rancher moved without thought, throwing himself into the line of fire. The blast tore through the room, and pain ripped across his shoulder, driving him to his knees. The girl screamed for the first time, the sound raw and alive. Rage surged in him, hotter than the wound. He fired once more, and the scarred man fell backward into the dirt, his face frozen in shock. The cabin sank into silence, smoke curling through the broken door. The rancher, bleeding and unsteady, turned to the girl. Her hands reached for him without hesitation, pressing against his wound, tears streaming down her face. He managed a faint smile despite the blood. He had risked everything, and for the first time in years, he felt the risk was worth it. The smoke hung thick in the cabin, curling through the shattered door and broken glass like a shroud. The girl's hands pressed hard against his wound, her breath quick and shallow. But her silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of despair. It was urgency, determination, as if her touch alone could keep him here. The rancher gritted his teeth, forcing himself upright, though every movement burned. Outside, the wind carried the faint groans of the man struck down first, but the others lay still, swallowed by the dirt they had brought with them. He pushed the door open wider and stepped into the cold night. Moonlight revealed the scarred man sprawled in the yard, eyes open but unseeing. The land felt quieter now, as though the earth itself had taken a long breath. The girl followed, wrapped in his coat, small against the wide emptiness. She kept close behind, her gaze never leaving his staggering frame. They said nothing. Words would only break what the silence already carried. The rancher gathered what he could: his horse, the girl's thin bundle, the rifle still warm in his grip. The wounded man by the fence whimpered, hand outstretched, but the rancher did not finish him. Mercy was not forgiveness, but he would not give death where it begged. Instead, he pulled the girl onto the horse first, steadying her with his good arm before climbing behind her. His body protested, hot blood soaking. His sleeve, yet his hold around her, was firm. They rode out slow, the hooves muffled against the hard ground. The cabin grew smaller behind them, until it was nothing but a dark mark swallowed by, as his burden. And now it was his fight too. He stepped inside, shut the door firm, and began checking the rifle propped by the wall. His heart thudded steady as a drum. The storm was coming. ChatGPT said, "The hours that followed stretched long and fragile, each moment balanced between fear and the small, unspoken attempts at trust." The rancher built a fire with the wood stacked near the door, his hands practiced, movements slow so as not to alarm her. When the flames finally caught, warmth filled the cabin, chasing the edge of the cold. He set a small pan across the grate, poured what beans he had left, and let the smell drift into the silence. She did not come closer, but her eyes followed him. When he finally slid the pan toward her, she hesitated, then ate in small, careful bites, as though each one had to be earned. He did not watch her directly, but the sound of her chewing, faint as it was, felt like a promise that life had not left her yet. Later, when the fire settled into a steady glow, he checked his rifle and set it across the table. She stiffened, shrinking back, and he saw again the bruises on her arms, the way her fingers clutched at the quilt like a shield. He said nothing, only pulled a small pistol from his belt and laid it gently on the wood between them. He turned it so the handle faced her, then leaned back. At first, she only stared. Then her hand, trembling but curious, reached out. She touched the metal as if it might burn her, and when she looked up, he gave a small nod. He showed her how to hold it steady, how to breathe before pulling the trigger, never rushing, never raising his voice. Her hands shook, but slowly under his calm gaze, the weapon no longer looked like a tool of terror, but something she could command. The night deepened, and with it came a strange stillness. He unrolled his blanket on the floor, keeping a respectful distance. But he saw her watching him as he set his worn boots aside. She did not speak, but her eyes held a question. Why? Why had he stayed? Why had he not left her like the others? He had no answer simple enough to give, so instead he lifted his shirt slightly, showing the scar that crossed his ribs, a long, pale line carved by another man's violence years ago. Her breath caught, and then, slowly, she pushed back her sleeve. Faint scars marked her wrist, places where ropes had cut deep. They held each other's gaze, not with pity, but with the quiet recognition of people who had both been broken and yet endured. For the first time she shifted closer to the fire, her face touched by its light. He offered no words, only poured her a little water and set it by her side. She accepted, and in that moment something fragile and unspoken passed between them. It was not trust yet, but the seed of it. A bond forged not by promises, but by silence, by scars, by the simple act of surviving together. The night outside pressed dark and heavy, but inside the cabin, a brief pocket of peace flickered like the fire itself, delicate, precious, and worth defending when the storm came. The night did not last long enough. Before the fire had burned down to embers, the rancher's horse gave a sharp snort outside, the kind it only made when danger was near. He rose quietly, rifle in hand, and motioned for the girl to stay low. She froze, clutching the quilt to her chest, her eyes wide but silent. The boards of the porch creaked under heavy boots, then more than one shadow crossed the cracks beneath the door. Voices muttered low, rough with drink and anger. The first knock was not a knock at all, but a fist slamming against the wood. "We know she's in there," a man growled. The rancher's jaw tightened. He recognized the tone. Ownership disguised as authority. The girl shrank further into the corner, trembling. He stood steady, though his heartbeat thudded in his throat. "She's not yours to take," he called back, voice low and even. Silence followed for a beat, then harsh laughter. "Everything, night." The girl leaned against him, her head against his chest, listening to the steady, stubborn beat of his heart. She did not cry, though her shoulders shook now and then. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, each breath fogging the cold air, knowing they had not reached safety, but had left behind something final. Hours passed before dawn began to grey the sky. He stopped near a ridge where the earth was soft and dug with one hand, each shovelful cutting deeper into his strength. She watched, silent, as he laid one of the dead men to rest beneath the soil. Not out of reverence, but because leaving bodies to rot meant coyotes, and coyotes meant trails others could follow. When the earth was packed again, he stood over it, his shoulders heavy, his wound searing, but his spirit unbroken. The girl reached for his hand. Small, trembling fingers curled around his rough ones. For the first time since he had found her, her touch was not born of fear, but choice. He looked down, and though no words passed between them, something shifted. They were no longer stranger and burden. They were survivors bound by blood spilled and silence shared. The threat had ended, but its echo would follow. Together they turned from the mound of earth and rode toward whatever waited beyond the ridge, carrying the weight of loss and the fragile spark of something new. Weeks turned into months, and the land slowly shifted from the bitter edge of winter into the softer breath of spring. The rancher and the girl kept moving, never staying long in one place, but each stop built a rhythm between them. He taught her how to build a fire without trembling hands, how to spot fresh tracks in the dirt, how to trust the sound of silence as much as the crack of a branch. She spoke little, yet her eyes carried more now, no longer the hollow pools of someone waiting for the end, but the steady light of someone, learning to live again. The rancher's wound healed into another scar, a jagged line across a body already marked by time and loss. He did not complain, though the pain lingered in the cold mornings. What mattered was the presence beside him, the quiet shape at his fire, the small hands that helped mend his coat or pour water into his tin. In caring for her, he had found something that war, solitude, and age had stolen, the sense that life could still be shared. One evening, as the sun sank behind a line of cottonwoods, they stopped near a small rise. Together they stacked stones into a mound, not for the men who had fallen, but for what had ended that night at the cabin. Her fear, his wandering, their loneliness. It stood as a grave for the silence that once defined them both. Neither spoke, but both lingered long, watching the wind curl around the stones, listening to the hush of the prairie. Time did not erase the past, but it softened the edges. The girl's laughter, faint and uncertain at first, came back one evening when his horse sneezed loudly and nearly sent his hat flying. He did not remember the last time laughter had filled the air near him, and the sound stayed with him long after. In that moment, he knew survival had given way to something more, an imperfect peace, fragile, but real. Years later, folks might still whisper about the cabin and the blood spilled there. But the truth lived elsewhere, carried on the wind with two riders who chose each other in silence. And when the rancher finally closed his eyes one last time, the world would remember not the man who walked away, but the one who stayed. Like the last note of a violin, his choice lingered, quiet and eternal.